recording this one pretty early. On Mondays, I've got Monday, I guess, when I'm recording this. I don't know if I'm posting it on Monday or not. But I've got classes, and I have to go into Glasgow early. But I figured I would just record this ahead of time. Made some coffee, which crushes. And I thought it would be fun to talk about first editions, because the last video I talked about Francois Sagan. I had a first edition, I guess first English edition, because the first edition of her book was in French, so a first edition wouldn't do me any good, but a first English edition of that book. And I've got a few others, and it also delves a little bit into the world of poetry, which I rarely recommend because I know it's a little bit of a niche, and not everyone is all in for poetry, but I am, and I have a huge penchant for the confessional movement of poetry, which is probably names you might be familiar with, the most famous being Sylvia Plath, and then the others being Robert Lowell and Sexton, Adrian Rich. Just this movement in poetry that really took off in the 60s, where they started writing about so much personal, internal struggle, strife, grappling with mental illness, a lot of depression, things that really were taboo for the time to write poetry about. Poetry for so long existed more in the observational and the natural world and myth. It was very literary or imagistic, and they took kind of the outside world and brought it inside, put it on the page, and then gave it back out to the world. And I just think anyone who has the capacity to move an entire form forward, to just change the landscape of poetry entirely, because so much poetry now, especially people who are writing it for the first time, write confessionally. They write from their personal experiences, and none of that would really be possible without the confessionalists coming and just bearing it all out on the page. This is the first edition I ever got. I don't know if it's readable really, but it's called To Bedlam and Partway Back by Sexton, who was a contemporary of Plath's. She's phenomenal. This is her first collection. It's also very confessional. She writes a lot about girlhood, childhood, motherhood. It's really, really good. And it was pretty controversial with her editor when she had finished this manuscript, tried to convince her to not publish it. He thought it was maybe inappropriate or a little too revealing. But I'm really glad she didn't listen to him. She even has a poem in here about him and about his suggestion, which is, I feel like it's called, I can't remember now, For John or something like that was his name. But it also contains what is one of my favorite poems of all time, which is called The Double Image. This is a poem, one of those rare poems where I would recommend anyone read it. It might not be for everyone, but it's so remarkably good that I think everyone should at least give it a chance. It is very long. I think in this book it's about 7 or 8 pages. It's totally free online to read, but it's well worth the effort. The second one I've got is another Sylvia Plath. This is Winter Trees and Crossing the Water. These are both hardcover, first editions published by Faber, and these were not published while she was alive. They actually were published in 1971, which is a few years after she died. And they're collected by her husband, Ted Hughes, and put into these two collections brought out by Faber, who published a lot of Hughes's work. But they're also very beautiful. They're not Ariel, that's her final collection she put together while she was still alive, which is my favorite book of poetry that ever exists. But these books are beautiful. Even the paperback version of Crossing the Water looks like this, and Winter Trees also looks like this. There are smaller paperback ones. I think I have a copy also of Winter Trees and Crossing the Water that are paperbacks, so I can write in them, because I'm not going to write in these first editions. But I also recommend them. I have this book coming out at the end of this year that I wrote with my writing partner Sam, called Poetry is Plagiarism. And in that book, there's an essay I wrote about Sylvia Plath, and that she was the first poet I ever had to learn to love. When I first read her work when I was much younger, I hated it. I thought it was so pretentious, indecipherable. I didn't understand what she was doing. But after spending so much time, I had read The Bell Jar and loved The Bell Jar, her novel, her only novel, and loved it. And so I knew I loved her content. And I knew she had such a reputation and was such a mammoth of a figure in the poetry world that I just read and reread. This is the copy of the book I had. It was just on the floor, but it's called Colossus. This is the first collection of poems she ever published. They're notably different than some of her later work. Her later work is a lot about her married life and her kids, and her early work is a lot about her father, who died when she was still very young. She's got a lot of good poems about him, and she's kind of just gaining her voice in the Colossus. But this is the book, this is the exact copy too, I've had for over a decade and read probably a dozen times. And when I first read it, I just didn't understand it at all. I didn't get it. And then eventually I got a little more. I started reading a bunch of different poetry, poems that I liked, more accessible stuff like Frank O'Hara or some of William Carlos Williams' work. Finding poetry that I liked immediately, Billy Collins as well. And then just kept returning. Just brute forced it kind of until I noticed a pattern and parsed out the things she was saying. So these poems take time. And I know I've made videos before that are like reading should be fun or just another piece of entertainment, but the best comp I have to reading Sylvia Plath would be probably watching like David Lynch movies, where super celebrated figure. David Lynch did a lot for movies and what's possible on the screen, did a lot with low budget, very uncompromising vision for what he wanted to put on the screen. And a lot of his stuff just exists as visual metaphor. And similarly, when I first watched his stuff, I found it kind of insufferable, not to be controversial. It just wasn't for me. And the more I watched it, the more I understood what was going on. You have to spend time. And I have plenty of friends who Lynch is their favorite director because they've watched everything he's done, and you develop a love for it, which feels notably different than just loving it immediately. The putting in the work in this sense is what's fun about reading it. You don't just get the immediate payoff you might get from a kind of pulp fiction or what is it called when you just write for the general audience? Just like a literary fiction? I don't know. What you would see probably put out on tables at a Barnes & Noble or Waterstones, where you can pick it up and read it and understand what's going on immediately. It requires a little bit more. So if you're trying to get into poetry, I might not start with Plath. I would read a little bit of Anne Sexton, maybe, and then build your way up to Plath. Or do what I did, start with Plath, hate it, read it a bunch, work your way through it. I would not start with the Colossus. These are a little more difficult to understand. I would probably start with Ariel. I'm not saying they're easier to understand, but they're a little more polished and a little more clean, and she definitely grew into her voice. I think it was published about 8 years after the Colossus was. So she's got a much firmer grip on how she wanted to write. I know this video is really long, and I started it by saying I was just going to talk about first editions, but whenever I start talking about Sylvia Plath, I just get so fired up because I find her to be just one of the best to ever do it. She is the person I probably model my own poetry after the most. Her voice is really, it's unparalleled. I could never do it. She's just remarkably talented. Even reading her journals, you're very much aware that she is a genius. I don't really know. This is kind of what's fun about having this channel, is I can just talk about anything. And if you're watching 12 minutes of me ramble about Sylvia Plath, I appreciate you. If you're not, I don't blame you, because why would you? There's much more interesting things to be doing with your time. But yeah, there's a lot of her content available out there. If you want something immediately accessible, you could read The Bell Jar, her novel. It's pretty intense, but it's really beautiful. It's semi-autobiographical, she published it under a pseudonym when she was alive. Much to her mother's chagrin, she did not love that there was this novel about, because the mother in the story is maybe not the greatest. Really good though, really approachable. You can read it. The language of it is a lot easier to understand. If you ever stumble across some first editions, this is what they look like. They're about 150 pounds each, probably. Although these were gifted to me. I paid about $100 for To Bedlam and Partway Back, but that's just because I love Anne Sexton and I love her poem, The Double Image. So, I don't normally recommend poetry to people, but I just had to talk about these two. I love them so much. The other confessional poets are good too. Robert Lowell and Adrienne Rich are the two most notable ones, at least for me. Their work is good too. And what's fun about poetry is that individual poems are you probably find all of them online without having to buy a book. So, could give it a shot pretty easily. Maybe I'll link a few. Link the Double Image and link some of Sylvia Plath's stuff in the video. Yeah. Well, thanks for watching this remarkably long video. That's it. I guess I appreciate you. Thanks for watching.